Today I'm going to talk about two technologies: digital search, which is primarily the way information comes to us from the internet, and writing. This is a written version of Homer's The Iliad. It was copied down into a codex, between book covers by hand in 1431 in Italy. It's beautiful, a beautiful manuscript. But Homer's Iliad was originally told aloud by many different bards or people who entertained by telling stories. And these storytellers, you can tell that the poems like the Iliad were originally delivered orally because there's lots of repetition in them, and there are these formulaic phrases. We call them epic epithets, like rosy-fingered dawn or wine-dark sea. Those were moments when both the storyteller and the crowd would kind of rest and just enjoy the sound of the poem. And that would also give the storyteller time to think about where he was going next in the story. We know that oral cultures pass down lots of information through poetry. You can think of all the details about shipbuilding in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And you can even just think about, I do this when I'm walking through the library looking for a book, but A, B, C, D, E, F, G, so you just have that song so that you can remember things. I taught my kids a song to remember our address so that they would never get lost. What's really interesting about the first writing, and this comes from an Etruscan monument from the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, is there's no space between words. There's just letters in a continuous stream. They call that continuous script. And that was true for a long time. The first alphabet was developed about between 1200 and 1100 BC. It was Phoenician. And to put that in context, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and humans have been around for 6 million years. Possibly modern humans, 200,000 years. Of course, everybody debates when humans began speaking, and I've put in a link there to an article in The Atlantic which talks about all the dates, but perhaps around 300,000. So writing is relatively a recent technology. The alphabet is a recent technology. And St. Augustine in his Confessions mentions being so surprised to see a monk sitting, reading silently. It rocked his world. Usually they all read together aloud. Continuous script can really only be read aloud. By sounding out each letter as you go, you get the words, you get where they begin and end, whereas you can't do that with the eye. It's only once space is put between words that reading becomes a primarily visual activity, shifts from reading aloud to reading silently and just looking at the words through your eyes. The codex, the bound covers of books, those bound manuscripts as well, at first, as well as print later, and it replaced the scroll really around 300 AD, and printing presses with movable type came into existence around 1450 AD. So what you read is Socrates' dialogue in which he objects to writing as a technology. He says it's inhuman and that it destroys people's memory. Well, inhuman, I'm not sure. I'm not sure any technology is inhuman, given that humans are so driven to invent technologies. Destroying memory? Well, the major change between print and manuscript culture, between the time where you could make lots of copies and where you could make a few copies, is the scientific revolution, right? because suddenly everybody had access to all the knowledge that had gone before. In an oral culture, you have to remember it through poetry. It's such a job just to pass on what everybody knows already that you can't focus so much on innovation. And the same with manuscript copying. Only a few people can write and only a few people can read, and there are only a few copies to be read. So it's more difficult in a culture like that to pass on knowledge and build on it. In a print culture, you can build on knowledge really easily. You can have a library full of all the volumes, and if you forget something, you can go back and look. So we might question Socrates and think about whether writing destroys memory or frees it up to do other things, frees your mind up to do more than just memorize facts. Now, the one thing that Socrates says that seems really powerful is he says, well, you can't ask a book to explain to you what it's saying. So Socrates is pointing out that we can't perform Socratic dialogue on a text. But take a look at the dialogue I had you read for today, and notice how often Phaedrus just says, yeah, sure, yes, certainly, very true. Or when Socrates says something in the negative, no, not at all, certainly not. He just agrees with him. There's one moment where he mocks him because of paying attention to an Egyptian tale. And Socrates says, well, if we all knew the truth now, we wouldn't need to look to the ancients, right? And then Phaedrus says, oh, of course, you're right, I'm sorry. And then I have another point here, which is, I think I'm performing a Socratic dialogue on Socrates' written text right now. Isn't that what we do when we read? I read and I look at the page and I think, is that true? Could that be true? Maybe it's not true in this case. If it's not true in this case, what does that say about all cases? Or whatever I think, and I write all over the margins. There's collections of marginalia by all the thinkers over time. People don't just sort of sit and read a text and think nothing except what it tells them to think. And then he talks about distance, which I'll talk about in a minute. I wanted to point out first one huge difference between Nicholas Carr and Socrates. Nicholas Carr is defending reading books over surfing the internet. And he says, to Google, ambiguity is just a bug that needs to be fixed. Whereas for him, ambiguity in a text opens up an idea for insight. It gives you a way to think your own thoughts about it and to decide what you think. So he's for ambiguity. Socrates is completely against it. He says, he's talking about who in their right mind would leave in writing instructions about how to do something, about any art, believing that the written word would be intelligible or certain for all time. To him, the written word is not. It's only if a person is there and you can ask them what they mean. So for Socrates, ambiguity is bad. For Carr, it's good. And we might think of them as the product of two different cultures. Carr is a product of print culture, Socrates of oral culture. The other feature in this dialogue with Phaedrus is Socrates' objection to the way that writing can be passed through time and space. It can be detached from context and, of course, from the physical body of the writer. And so it's alienating. Walter Ong, who has written many books about the advent of writing, the difference between writing and oral culture, and about technology, he says writing is a technology that restructures thought. That's the title of his essay. He says, and I think all of the people that I'm talking about agree with this, even Socrates. Technologies are transformations of consciousness. Now, he goes on to say that, yes, writing is alienating, but to live and to understand fully, we need not only closeness, but also distance. I don't know how many of you have ever looked back at something and you wrote and thought, oh, that's not true. I don't really think that. It's a good moment. It's when you get to revise and rethink and think harder. So closeness has its value. Here you can see a mountain climber in the Rockies. Distance has its value. And even great distance, this is the Rockies from space, the Rocky Mountains, has value. Look how they look like a wave. You really get a sense of the earth as having at one time been fluid with tectonic plates moving. Marshall McLuhan talks about technology in The Medium is the Message. And he says he's concerned with the personal and social consequences of any medium. And he considers any new technology or medium, he considers them as extensions of ourselves. And he says personal and social consequences of any medium result from the new scale that is introduced. So new technologies introduce new scales. What does he mean by that? Well, he says, for instance, take the train. He says the railway didn't introduce wheels or roads or movement or transportation, but it made it all faster and meant you could go further faster. So it created totally new kinds of cities and new kinds of work and new kinds of leisure and new kinds of thinking. So just to give you an example, say I want to figure out if there has been change in temperatures over the last century. And I am firmly ensconced in book culture. Well, this is what I would do. And I might have to travel to multiple libraries, or I might have to do a lot of interlibrary alone, but I would scour these books. Now, the National Climatic Data Center has the CDO, Climate Data Online Database. You can do mapping with it, you can search it. So what if I just said, tell me the hottest and coldest places. Tell me all the places from 1920 to 2020 that had temperatures 120 degrees or above, or negative 120 or below. And put it on a scatter plot for me. And I can just command the database to do that. Well, what I might notice is that more places are getting hotter and more places are getting colder. There's more weather extremes. Now, I've reduced ambiguity by doing this. Somebody in the city of, in one city in Ethiopia might say, oh, well, in our city it wasn't quite 120, it was 115. That kind of ambiguity is reduced by distance, just like you can't see a leaf looking at the Rocky Mountains from space. And reducing ambiguity can cause thinking problems. It can. So, for instance, you might want to check, right? Like, maybe the person who loaded the data into this database didn't properly compute Fahrenheit from Celsius. And then all the data is wrong, and then it's just a lie, whether intentional or not. But little variations here and there, if you don't let them distract you, if you pull them together, reduce the ambiguity, and look at them in one view, you can see something that you otherwise wouldn't have known. And we're going to talk about this later in this semester, visualizing data. I put a document in our Google Drive, Google Shared Drive, called Refine Google Searches. I'd really like you to look at it because you can get lots of information on very quick keystrokes that will help you really better control your searches using Google. And I also wanted to say, I also put into the Google Drive a PowerPoint about Google search. And in it, you'll see all the resources I read, published by Google primarily. Well, all of them are, I think. And the thing that I wanted to talk with you about in relation to Google search returns is PageRank, because Helen Gorgas wrote an article in which she said, typically undergraduate students think that Google's results indicate quality. So you don't go past page 1 because the highest quality resources are right there. Well, I want you to think about this for just 1 second. If you were a company building a search engine, what would be the most important thing? You're going to return links to pages, and your users are going to click on those links. I mean, I'd say the most important thing is that those links aren't broken. If you just get a set of returns with a whole bunch of broken links, you're going to think, this search engine doesn't work, and use something else. So PageRank has a lot to do with the stability of links as predicted by the corporations and organizations that produce those pages and that rely on pages already produced. Google claims it's quality, but it's also definitely about productivity. And in the PowerPoint I put in the Google Drive, I show you how some of the most important results appear on page 5 of a Google search. So don't believe that the best quality is right there. I also want to say that as digital humanists, we are working, as are all the librarians, to improve search and making use of new technologies so that it'll even improve Google's search because of the data that Google will want to rely on. If we build really high quality data that its machines can use very quickly, it will want to use it. And that's what we're working on. So this is not to say, oh, search is bad. It's not. It needs other values injected into it, the values that scholars and libraries at universities, the values that we have, which is really high quality scholarship done by world-renowned experts and checked by all the people who want to disprove them. So that's the end of the show. Thank you so much.